Askawikwasin, Natasawis Mack. We are here today in Mashasa, on the unceded homelands of the Nahaganset Nation. And as we reflect on all of the great talks that we hear today, it is also important that we think about how it is that we've come to be here today. It was 3 years ago when people emerged from their homes, donned their N95 masks, and braved a global pandemic to demand systemic change. Sparked by the repeated, brutally violent, and very public disregard for Black lives, the world seemed to collectively cry out that Black lives mattered. But more than just march and attest and demand, we also sought to understand. We wanted to know why we need to proclaim Black lives mattered when more than a century and a half had passed since our nation fought a civil war to affirm Black freedom, or so we were told. We wanted to know why vast racial inequalities persisted, even though it had been more than 50 years since we committed ourselves to judging each other on the content of our character, or so we believed. Essentially, what we wanted to know, in between binging episodes of The Tiger King and Squid Game, of course, was why the images that we saw on our screen didn't match the lessons we had learned in school. Now, I'm not here to condemn teachers. I am a teacher, and I know how difficult that job can be. In fact, when people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm in wildlife management. Still, the questions that arose 3 years ago were deep and exacting questions about who we were as a nation. And the answers that we had all consumed to that point, answers grounded in the mythology of perpetual progress, now seemed unsatisfying and wholly inaccurate. One of my first teaching positions was at a high school in Richmond, Virginia. And on the first day, the teachers get all the materials. You get things like the curriculum, you get the policy and procedures, and you get the calendar. And like any good teacher, the first thing I did was open the calendar and look for the days that we had off. I had just started, I wanted to know when I didn't need to be there. And all of the regular holidays were there. The winter break was there, and the spring break was there. And as I was going through the list, I noticed a holiday for someone who I didn't know. And I had recently graduated from the University of Rhode Island and got a BS in education, and BS stands for Bachelor's of Science, just so that we're clear. And I minored in history, so I felt like I knew a lot about the past. But then there was this person who had a holiday, and I had no idea who they were. And if you think about it, you kind of have to be a big deal to have your own holiday. People don't have their own holidays. President's Day is for all the presidents. Labor Day is for all the laborers. Maybe Jesus has Christmas, but you understand, you have to be a really big deal to have your own holiday. And there was this person who had their own holiday, and I had no idea who they were. So now I'm thinking maybe that degree I did get was BS. And for context, this was the early 2000s. The iPhone doesn't come out until 2003, which means I couldn't just go in my pocket and pull out the answer. These were the days when people used to wonder stuff. And you just kept on wondering because we didn't have smartphones to tell us all the answers. So for me to find the answer, I had to ask somebody. And I was hesitant because I didn't want that to be the first impression I made. But I wanted to know. So I mustered up the courage and I went over to one of my colleagues and I said, I was going through the calendar and I noticed that there's a holiday for this person who I don't know. And I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but could you tell me who they were? And they say, oh, yeah, what's the name? And I say, well, who was Lee Jackson King? And they say, well, Robert E. Lee Stonewall Jackson Martin Luther King Day. Yes, that was the answer. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe what they were saying. I think all I said at that time was, "Are you serious?" The thought never crossed my mind that this could be a mashup of these very different, almost diametrically opposed historical figures. But since then, I had a little time to think about it. And I guess in some bizarre, alternate reality, I could see how you might put these three together. They were all great minds. Okay. They were all great leaders. Well, this is true. They were. They were all freedom fighters. Well, I guess it depends how you define freedom fighter, because Martin Luther King was fighting for the freedom of all humanity, while Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson were fighting for the freedom to enslave people that looked like Martin Luther King. So maybe they were a little different. And this is when I became an actualist, because the triumvirate of Lee, Jackson, King only makes sense if you don't really think about it. But as an actualist, I would say Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson are able to become great minds, great leaders, and freedom fighters because they enslaved people. And it was their labor that allowed them to go to West Point and do the things that they did to get put into the history books. But those enslaved people, we don't remember them. We don't commemorate them. They're not in the history books. When we pick and choose who and what to include and exclude from the curriculum, we reveal more about who we are than we do about our past. Nelson Mandela said that education was the most powerful weapon we could use to change our world. And when we create narratives that equate Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson with Martin Luther King, that is a weapon. It's a weapon that justifies continued inequality by marginalizing and erasing the history and contributions of entire groups of people. Well, eventually in Virginia, they realized that maybe putting these people who fought for the perpetuation of slavery on the same day that we recognized our most iconic civil rights activists might not be a good idea. And in Virginia, they separate out the holiday. And they have Lee Jackson Day, and they have Martin Luther King Day. And that's the way it continues in Virginia until 2020, when people get off their couches, emerge from their homes, and demand systemic change. There, in the former capital of the Confederacy, they start to tear down the statues. But in Texas, I don't know what happens in Texas, but apparently they don't make it to the march, because today in 2023 in Texas, they still celebrate Confederate Heroes Day. Now, to this point, I've been talking about the South, but those of us north of the Mason-Dixon shouldn't get too comfortable in our condemnation, because it's not until 2019 that the people in Connecticut decide that it's important enough to put the history and experiences of peoples of African descent into the curriculum that they teach their children. And in the Ocean State, we don't make a similar curricular adjustment until 2021. So although delayed, progress is being made. But I guess it depends how you look at it. In November 2021, there was an article that ran in the Boston Globe with the headline, "Why do Indigenous students perform so poorly on state assessments in Rhode Island?" The writers interviewed 2 members of the Narragansett Nation, and they asked them, "Why do Native students do so bad on these tests?" Randy Noka said, "The history books are tinged with lies." And Wayne Everett said, "We don't teach the truth of all narratives." Both men sought to answer the question by questioning what it was we were teaching our children. Because, like Nelson Mandela, they understood that although education could be used to build people up, it could also be used to tear them down. As I come to the end of my talk, I want to thank you for listening. But if I'm honest, I hope that you will do more than listen. Because what emerged 3 years ago, these calls for systemic change, greater equity, and more inclusion, have not yet been realized. And it is our collective responsibility to, in tangible ways, seek to be the people that we tell our children we are. Because education is the most powerful weapon we can use to change our world. Katabatash, thank you.